Welcome. Good morning, everybody. It's lovely to see all of you. We'll just wait a few minutes while everybody is entering the room. Okay, Matthias, am I ready? Are we ready to start?
I'd say so. It's 2 minutes past.
Fantastic. Great. Well, good morning, everybody. And I welcome you to the LSE Anthropology department and to the fourth event in our tribute to our friend and colleague, David Graeber. We began by launching his just published book, The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity, which he completed with the archaeologist David Wengrow just before he passed away. We then moved to his ethnography of Madagascar, followed by discussion of his book on value. And today we turn to debt, the first 5,000 years. David began this book with a very basic question. Why do we feel that we must repay our debts? A question that was so important in the wake of a debt crisis when millions of homes were being reclaimed as an economic crisis hit many parts of the world, followed by austerity measures, all in the name of curtailing sovereign debt. The book was published in 2011, just as David became involved in Occupy Wall Street, in the Occupy Wall Street movement, and it became an international bestseller. David was writing debt as he arrived at the anthropology department at Goldsmiths, where we first met. And today I'm delighted to have two wonderful scholars who shared those days with David at Goldsmiths and who later also traveled alongside him to LSE. The first is Keith Hart, who was at that time a professor of anthropology at Goldsmiths and then a centennial professor at LSE. And the second is Maka Suarez, who had just arrived as a PhD student at Goldsmiths and who David and I were to supervise together and who joined the PhD writing up seminar when we moved to LSE, though she remained at Goldsmiths. Let me tell you a bit more about Keith and Maka before handing over to both of them. Keith Hart is an anthropologist and a self-taught economist who now lives in Paris and in Durban. Today, he describes himself as a full-time writer. Keith started out studying Latin and ancient Greek. He explored Atlantic society from the perspective of Africans in West Africa, North America, the Caribbean, Britain, France, and South Africa. He has lived and worked in 24 countries for the longest time in Cambridge. He has worn many hats. He's been a development consultant, an experience that led him to coin the term informal economy. He's also been a gambler. He's been a journalist. He's been a publisher. Many people in this room will know the Prickly Paradigm Press, which actually began as Keith's baby. Keith is a man of many colors, but particularly of note for today is that he is one of the foremost economic anthropologists. He has some 200 items posted at academia.edu. And amongst his many publications are Money in an Unequal World, The Memory Bank, and The Hitman's Dilemma. With Chris Hahn, he has also edited Market and Society, The Great Transformation Today, Rethinking Relevance of Kalpalani. And he's co-authored Economic Anthropology, History, Ethnography, Critique. Keith was on the internet long before many of us, and he calls himself a network entrepreneur whose research is mainly online. He co-founded the Open Anthropology Cooperative, which reached 22,000 members worldwide. At present, Keith is writing an intellectual and political biography of Marcel Mauss, whom he considers to be the founder of the human economy, a term that he himself has developed greatly in the last 2 decades, and that also inspired David. About to be published next spring is Self in the World, Connecting Life's Extremes, which is an account of his personal journey, a call for academia to change how we learn, and hopefully an inspiration for students of all ages and interests. Keith had a close association with David for many years, especially between 2001 and 2016. After David passed away, he published Anthropology as a Revolutionary Project, the political legacy of David Graeber, and also an obituary for David. He has also published a long review of the Debt book, David Graeber and the Anthropology of Unequal Society. There's no better anthropologist than Keith to give us a grand engagement with the grand Debt and the grand David. So let me turn now to Maka Suarez. Maka came into our lives at Goldsmiths. She had trained in business, economics, and political economy, and she knew that she needed to undertake a PhD in anthropology. She had a wonderful project, which was to explore how predatory financial capitalism through the loans of subprime mortgages and unsecured employment in Spain had made a whole load of Ecuadorian migrants who were in Barcelona default on their mortgage repayments in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis. She sought to understand how these processes impacted all aspects of the lives of these migrants, including, in the most intimate realms of gender, kinship, and family. And she wanted to understand in particular how these migrants became involved in the platform for people affected by mortgages, or LAPA for its Spanish acronym, a grassroots social movement to combat the foreclosures which were evicting people from their homes in a form of debt justice. After her PhD, Maka returned to Ecuador, where she co-founded Kaleidos, the Center for Interdisciplinary Ethnography, a space which she co-directs as a visiting professor at the University of Cuenca right now. The work she undertook in Ecuador had made her expand her fields into medical anthropology, as she continues her concerns to explore the contradictions faced by many people who migrate to improve their living conditions, but find themselves constantly underemployed, over-indebted, striving to be part of an increasingly ephemeral global middle class. Maka recently became a part of the Department of Anthropology at the University of Oslo as assistant professor, but she's currently on leave and joins us now very early from Princeton, the Institute of Advanced Studies, where she's on a 1-year fellowship to work on her book manuscript. It's called Against the Odds, Activism, Debt, and Labor in Times of Crisis, and it's based on her work on Ecuadorian migrants in Barcelona, a book we all await, Maka. Maka's work shares much in common with David, concerns around debt, which are grounded in movements taking action for real democratic transformation. Today, she will provide a way to think with David, drawing on her experiences of working with him while doing research on subprime mortgages, defaulting on these debts, and creative forms of social organizing against indebtedness and precarity, despite all the odds. So yeah, welcome to both of you. And before maybe I give the floor to you, Maka, let's first have Keith. Over to you, Keith. Thank you.
Good morning, or midday, it is for me. I'm going to read this because I just felt that it was too risky to jazz the thing. David Graeber's Debt, The First 5,000 Years, was published in summer 2011. In August, September of that year, he took part in the first New York City General Assembly that formed the Occupy Wall Street movement. Much of the contemporary world revolves around claims we make on each other and on things. ownership, obligations, contracts, and payments of taxes, wages, rents, and fees. David addressed these through a focus on debt in broad historical perspective. It's a central issue in global politics today at every level of society. The class struggle between debtors and creditors to distribute costs after the long credit boom went bust in 2008 is universal. David held that the social logic of debt is revealed most clearly when money is involved. Following Nietzsche, he argued that money introduced the first measure of unequal relations between buyer and seller, creditor and debtor. Indeed, one school of thought holds that money is debt. This includes the French and German traditions. Money was always both a commodity and a debt token, giving rise to much political and moral contestation, especially in the ancient world. Whereas Rousseau traced inequality to the invention of property, David located the roots of human bondage, slavery, tribute, and organized violence in debt relations. The contradictions of indebtedness, escalating class conflict between creditors and debtors fed by money and markets led the first world religions to articulate notions of freedom and redemption, often involving calls for debt cancellation. The book contrasts what he calls human economies with those dominated by money and markets or commercial economies. These societies are not necessarily more humane, but they, and I quote, they are economic systems primarily concerned not with the accumulation of wealth, but with the creation, destruction, and rearrangement of human beings. They use money, but mainly as what he calls social currencies, which maintain relations between people rather than being used to purchase things. Quote again, in a human economy, each person is unique and of incomparable value because each is in a unique nexus of relations with others, end quote. Yet money forms make it possible to treat people as identical objects in exchange, and that requires violence. Brutality is omnipresent. Violence is inseparable from money and debt, even in the most human of economies, where ripping people out of their familiar context is commonplace. This is taken to another level when they are drawn into systems like the Atlantic slave trade. Slavery and freedom, a pair driven by a culture of honor and indebtedness, culminate in the ultimate contradiction of modern liberal economics, a worldview that conceives of individuals as being social isolates. David then organizes the world history of money in 4 stages. The first urban civilizations from Mesopotamia onwards, the axial age of world religions, the Middle Ages, and what he calls the great capitalist empires that ended in 1971 when the US dollar abandoned gold. Money oscillates between 2 broad types, credit and currency or bullion. Between money as a virtual measure of personal relations like IOUs and as impersonal things made from precious metals. The recent rise of virtual credit money may indicate another long swing in money's central focus. Ours could be, he says, a multipolar world more like the Middle Ages than the last 2 centuries. It could offer more scope for human economies, or at least social currencies. The debt crisis might provoke revolutions. Perhaps the institutional complex based on states, money, and markets that sustain capitalism will be replaced by forms of society more directly responsive to ordinary people and their reliance on what he calls everyday communism. Davies' historical vision has no room for a great transformation in the 19th century and is therefore opposed not only to the Marxists and the liberals, but also to Karl Polanyi. Most anthropologists of the last century conceived of a world safe for fieldwork-based ethnography, but another minority interest coexisted with this. I call this the anthropology of unequal society. Rousseau's discourse on inequality launched modern anthropology as the critique of unequal society. Morgan and Engels were heavily indebted to him when they reconstructed human history as the evolution of society from a kinship matrix to states based on class divisions. This genre was continued by Lévi-Strauss after the Second World War, by Suarez and by Eric Wolf, but with less explicit political content than their predecessors. Overlapping the millennium, this thread's main exponents have been Jack Goody and David Graeber. Goody sought to undermine Western claims to superiority over the main Asian societies. He downplayed the Industrial Revolution that allowed Europeans to take over the world in the 19th century. Following Brodel, Goody preferred to point to the similarities between industrial capitalism and what he called the merchant cultures of pre-industrial civilizations. He claimed that Marx misread merchant capitalism, but he did not address Marx's case for treating industrial capital as strategically different. Weber, too, gets short shrift for suggesting that modern capitalism differs from its predecessors. Given their common origins in the Bronze Age urban revolution, Goody reminds us that modern European capitalism diffused faster to Asia than the Italian Renaissance to Northwest Europe. Despite a barrage, this is now me, despite a barrage of propaganda telling us that we now live in a modern age of science and democracy, our dominant institutions are still those of agrarian civilization. Territorial states, embattled cities, landed property, warfare, racism, bureaucracy, literacy, impersonal money, long-distance trade, work as a virtue, world religion, and the nuclear family. The rebellion of the bourgeoisie against the old regime was co-opted in mid-century by national capitalism in a series of political revolutions of the 1860s and 1870s. This severely set back humanity's emancipation from inequality. Consider the shape of world society today. A remote elite of white, middle-aged, middle-class men, the men in suits, rule masses who are predominantly poor, darker, female, and young. The rich countries who can no longer reproduce themselves vainly try to stem the inflow of migrants. Our world resembles nothing so much as the old regime in France before the revolution. So Goody may have a point in asking us to reconsider how exceptional our societies are. I've taken part in a conference and book called Debt in the Ancient Mediterranean and Near East, which was inspired by David's debt book. He drew attention to the political economy underpinning a sequence of ancient empires in Western Eurasia, from the Persians and the classical Greeks through Alexander's conquests to Republican and Imperial Rome and finally the Arab conquest of the Mediterranean. Its logic hinged on the need to this political economy. Its logic hinged on the need to provision vast armies on prolonged marches. That meant using precious metal coinage sustained by a network of mines, states, and mercenary soldiers, then converting conquered peoples into slaves to be sold for the money needed to complete the cycle. There seems little doubt that Western empires from 1500 to 1800 relied on a similar logic, but they were unable to take over the world until industrial capitalism raised their technological competence to a far higher level than the rest. Marxists and liberals agreed that a world change was taking place in 19th century Britain. But Hegel's historical model was very different from Marxism's successive stages, that is, from feudalism to capitalism to socialism. His three phases were based on the family and the land, the market economy of urban civil society, and the modern state, respectively. These now coexisted under the coordinating guidance of the state. Both Polanyi and Marx missed the revolutions of the 1860s and 70s, where Marx had a better excuse than Polanyi since he was living through them. These revolutions installed a new class alliance in the leading countries based on a partnership between capitalists and the traditional enforcers that I call national capitalism. This new alliance soon spawned legal conditions for modern corporations, as well as a massive expansion of state property and a bureaucratic revolution at all levels of the economy. Mass production and consumption were the result. Thomas Piketty's book on capital was the smash hit of our times, apart from David's, of course. It was based on serious economics, up to 2 centuries of national income accounting for a few rich countries. An economist who can quote Balzac can't be all bad. I identified 3 reasons for his success. First, Piketty brought inequality back onto the mainstream agenda, just as Occupy Wall Street did with its We Are the 99%. And this touched a nerve after neoliberal responses to the financial crisis included bailing out the rich and making the poor pay. Second, Piketty's argument rests on 2 simple equations describing the relationship between capital and labor over the last 200 years. He uses these to demonstrate that capital's share of national income must always increase. It's unlikely that teeming historical diversity in the last 2 centuries can be captured by timeless categories and equations. Third, against the notion that capitalists make their money from producing competitively for profit, Piketty claimed that property was a growing component of wealth. Inheritance and rent were neglected factors in distribution today. I would argue, despite the obvious correspondences and lingering influence of the agrarian civilization, there is something special about the plutocracy built up in recent decades. The rise of modern corporations comes from their being granted the rights of individual citizens by the US Supreme Court in 1884, and they now combine those rights with their long-held special privileges, like limited liability for debt. Even the Romans, not noticed as champions of democracy, limited the spending of the rich on political campaigns. The US Supreme Court recently refused to accept any restriction on corporate political spending since it would infringe their human rights. They also allowed companies exemption from government rules on grounds of religious belief. These corporations once built their wealth by producing industrial commodities for profit at prices cheaper than their competitors. Now they rely on extracting rents, transfers sanctioned by political power, rather than on producing for profit in competitive markets. Thus, Big Pharma makes more money from patents granted by Congress than the entire Medicare budget. Sony makes 75% of its revenues not from machines, but from DVDs that are reproduced almost without cost from movies already sold in cinemas. They call duplicating these electronic movies piracy. Goldman Sachs retrieved from the US Treasury at 100% of face value the $90 billion that was lost by insurance giant AIG in the 2008 crash. These rent seekers are not punished for stealing from the public, but are bailed out by our taxes and held up as shining examples of super rich consumption to a public that has exchanged equal citizenship for bread and circuses or reality TV. This is decadence. There are no longer any political solutions to our economic problems as a result. Marx held that capitalist profit subordinated rent and interest to his logic. This is why he and Engels thought that Victorian England held the future of the world economy. New phases of capitalist development and decline have been identified ever since. The American macroeconomist Dean Baker provides much insight into rentier capitalism in the US today. Selling stuff for profit means adding value through production. Rent seeking, and I quote Wikipedia, is an attempt to derive economic rent by manipulating the social or political environment in which economic activities occur, rather than by adding value. Rent and interest, that is banking, no longer take their scale, form, and function from industrial capitalist production for profit, as Marx insisted in Capital. As the focus of political economy tipped away from industrial production in the broadest sense towards rent derived from political privilege, it is hard to see how the richest 1% today could have done so well in the last 3 decades otherwise than by this means, given the overall stagnation of production and real wages in this period. The digital revolution in communications is highly relevant since many intangible commodities can now be copied easily at no cost. If you steal my cow, I can no longer milk it, but no one loses out if I copy your song. Entertainment is the fastest growing sector of the world economy after finance. In the infancy of national capitalism before the First World War, did markets become more monopolistic than before? National capitalism's rise to dominance after the First World War is central to understanding today's economic crisis. Digital retail management regimes now being installed around the world illustrate the dominance of political and legal coercion in the economy now. Rent-seeking now trumps value added through production. The war over intellectual property escalates to ever higher levels of absurdity, and the rise of big tech has extended corporate command and control like never before. With Marx and Engels, I believe that the machine revolution can be a force for greater economic democracy, but the open source and free software movements have lost the influence they once promised. Our main hope is to mobilize global networks to develop the democracy, knowing that we are faster and more, and there are more of us than them. Now, this was certainly David Graeber's project, and I will end with what even for me is something like an encomium. David's book is or will be the biggest bestseller by an anthropologist ever, even over Ruth Benedict's Patterns of Culture, the previous front runner. In 2011, he spent sabbatical leave from Goldsmiths in New York, where he was able to promote the book heavily before becoming a leading figure in the Occupy Wall Street movement. He was invited by the German president to debate on national television with the leader of the Social Democratic Party. And soon after that, Det sold 30,000 copies in 2 weeks in Germany. In the previous decade, his books were translated into many languages, and his strongest following, I would think, is in Japan, Korea, and China. That's phenomenal success was not an accident or a freak of creative genius. Anthropology narrowed its scope in the last century to meet the needs of academic bureaucracy and lost its public appeal in the process. David set out to write a big book with big ideas that allowed readers to place themselves in history. Anthropologists, in adopting fieldwork-based ethnography as their standard, settled for narrow localism and a truncated vision of their own history, finding in ethnography a replacement for racist colonial empire, while ignoring the fragmentation of world society into many myopic nationalisms. David bypassed all of this to resurrect the Victorian polymath, and the world thanked him profusely for it. But there were other strings to his methodological bow. Chief of them, the ability to combine academic life with revolutionary politics, when his colleagues were mostly trapped in universities committed to bureaucratizing capitalism. From the time he was a graduate student, he trained himself to write accessibly for the general public. He wrote each piece twice, once for himself and another for everyone else. David's intellectual success in a curtailed lifetime drew on self-conscious methods, vision, imagination, endurance through hardship, for sure. Reading with no bounds, love of comparative ethnography, writing what Nietzsche described as a preference to be understood rather than admired, and not for knowing and over-acute readers. Also, of course, active participation in democratic politics and returning to anthropology's original mission as the study of humanity as a whole. You can call that genius if you like. I prefer to call it a personal synthesis built on disciplined hard work over an extraordinary range of human activities. If only we could each aim to emulate him, at least in some respects. That's it.
Thank you, Keith. Thank you very much for this grand vision of how to read Det and how to understand what David was trying to do. And I'm now going to turn over to Maka for another kind of reading of working with David.
Yes, thank you very much, Alba, and thank you very much, Keith, too. It is a different kind of reading. I will switch scales a little bit, but good morning or evening or night to everyone here today. It's great to be with you. Can you hear me well? Okay. The title of the talk is Thinking About Debt with David Graeber and LAPA. Let me begin by saying that this is a thought experiment, a phrase David often used and that I find really useful. In this talk, I'd like to propose an approach to debt, the first 5,000 years, that connects the book to David's earlier work on fragments of an anarchist anthropology and his latest work with David Wengrow on the dawn of everything. I think there are many different readings of the Book of Debt. My own reading of David's work is in light of 10 years of ethnographic research with Latin American migrants in Spain who became involved in the country's largest movement for the right to housing, the Platform for People Affected by Mortgages, or LAPA, as I will call it, for its short Spanish acronym. My research focuses on the relationship between political mobilization, mortgage debt, and transnational migration. My interlocutors were being foreclosed and evicted from their homes, which were bought during the housing bubble. On average, they owed over 250,000 euros. They joined LAPA in despair and out of guilt for not paying their debts. The movement helped them transform their guilt into outrage by shifting the grand narrative from individual failure into a counter narrative on massive financial fraud. In what follows, I engage with David's concept of debt and freedom, trying to illuminate some of the challenges I ran into while theorizing what debt meant to my interlocutors and fellow activists. So, it was January 11th, 2012. I had just returned to London from a preliminary field visit to Barcelona. David was on leave that year and in New York, but was on a short visit to London. Most of his time and his mind space were, however, still in New York, where he had inspired and was collaborating with the Occupy movement. As we ate some delicious Thai food, one of his favorite activities, David detailed his time with Occupy. Meanwhile, I was trying to get a word in, and everyone who knows Graeber knows this is hard, to figure out my own research. In between dishes of prawn panangs, charcoal duck, lots of wet rice, and Thai iced tea, David turned around and said, I quote him, "What's interesting here is not only why has debt become the focus of this movement, but why it has been so effective. It's notorious that debt is very hard to organize around. We keep talking about debt strikes, debt this, debtors that, and everybody keeps trying to come up with a formula, but it's incredibly difficult. Part of the reason why is because this sort of all morality is very hard to convince people it's not their fault. What's interesting here is you have a really effective broad grassroots movement focusing on debt. You could ask why debt becomes a focus and why it's worked in a certain way. So the question is, in what way? So let me begin with fragments, trying to answer this question, and its relation to the book on debt. In fragments, David describes a number of invisible spaces where direct forms of democracy are already taking place. To him, it is in these spaces that, I quote him, the potential for insurrection and the extraordinary social creativity that seems to emerge out of nowhere in revolutionary moments actually comes, unquote. In the book on debt, on the other hand, David defines the principle of communism as, quote, the foundation of all human sociability, unquote. Communism implies spaces free of debt, in which all people are able to contribute to a common project, given the abilities they already have. As he explains, unlike hierarchy, communism is not based on relationships of precedent or status, but of cooperation. And unlike exchange, communism does not intend to end relationships by paying back what is owed, but rather building a sociality in which one aspires to live in. Communism would then be the moral principle of economic life operating at the heart of the invisible spaces suggested by David in his anarchist anthropology. So I want to give you an ethnographic vignette to analyze how this moral principle organized the everyday realities lived by Latin American migrants to complicate David's theorizing. Hector was a 48-year-old man at the time of our interview, and his family was able to get what many families desired at LAPA, canceling their mortgage debt after being foreclosed. In Spain, mortgage law dictates that a mortgaged home is not the sole collateral to the debt. A bank can collect on any remaining debt after the house is auctioned. The predatory nature of this law translates into debts in the hundreds of thousands for my interlocutors after they have lost the property. So, full cancellation of a mortgage debt felt indeed like a victory, as Hector put it. Oddly then, most Latin American migrants ended up celebrating losing their houses to the bank in exchange for a full debt cancellation. However, Hector came to another realization right at the same time. He and his family had no place to live. His wife's monthly income of 600 euros could not pay for a place to rent, not if they wanted to pay the bills and have enough to live. They were left with one option, La Paz Obra Social, a project based on the reoccupation of buildings belonging to banks rescued with public funds and which sat empty for years. The idea was to relocate families like Hector's. The names of La Paz project is a play on words. Every large bank in Spain has an obra social, a philanthropic entity supporting cultural events or alleviating social problems. In Catalonia, for instance, they often fund Catalan language promotion or similar social events. LAPA thought it would establish its own strategy for solving real social problems by occupying empty buildings and using them for what they saw as its intended purpose, house people. La Paz housing reoccupation project for evicted families was criticized by both the left and the right. For leftist and long-term squatters, it was not radical enough because the strategy was not a permanent reappropriation. For conservatives, occupation was a crime and a threat to private property. For my interlocutors, it was a respite, but not an optimal solution. Hector family is just one example. There were a significant number of single mothers and their children unemployed or in low-paid jobs, which constituted a great portion of subprime mortgages in Spain. And this has also happened in other places like in the US. When I interviewed Hector and his family, they had been living in the occupied building for 4 months. The experience had been very difficult for them, and they hoped to buy an apartment again in the future. Hector was just one case among many people for whom home ownership was still the preferred housing option and a marker of success. Why did my interlocutors want to own a house or an apartment rather than occupying one or even renting it? To try and answer this question, I'd like to connect debt with the dawn of everything. One of David's most important invitations in his book on debt is to move away from an omnipresent language of debt. Thinking with David means questioning why people narrate their lives in the idiom of debt and examining whether and how an alternative approach is even possible. David goes to extraordinary lengths to illuminate the very mechanisms that prevent us from living without debt. The biggest endeavor of his book, to my mind, is showing us a path to freedom. Real freedom we can already access if we choose to recognize that many big theories are in fact forms of reproducing a ruling class or the legitimacy of the state. David knew wholeheartedly that anthropology is uniquely well placed to document the sides of moral and monetary indebtedness. In The Dawn of Everything, David, along with David Wengrove, characterized freedom as the potential for doing things otherwise through 3 concepts of freedom that they present. First, freedom to move or relocate. So the idea of being free to leave a place in the face of danger or otherwise. Then freedom to refuse orders, or how not to be bound by hierarchy. Finally, freedom to shape new social realities by choosing what is at the center of our existence. I'm interested here in following the first freedom, freedom of movement, as it is key in understanding why Latin American migrants became indebted in the first place and why they would consider doing it again today. There are two key moments in which Latin American migrants journey when they incur into debt. So these are essential. First, when they decide to travel irregularly to Spain. The trip required anything from $4,000 to $5,000 US dollars, which were almost invariably a debt acquired in their home countries in order to move to Spain. The second moment is buying a mortgage property. This was done in order to bring their families from Latin America to Spain. Migrants needed to show adequate proof of housing. Buying a home was the fastest route to reunifying with their loved ones, mainly moving children from Latin America to Spain. Let me illustrate this with another ethnographic vignette. The thing is, I didn't even want to buy a flat. I was trying to rent one, said Juan. He had been trying to rent a flat in order to bring his wife, Paulina, and their 3 children from Ecuador to Spain under a family reunification scheme. They had been apart for nearly 2 years. It was his reunification application that pushed him to look for a new place to live, since he needed to demonstrate to immigration services proof of suitable accommodations for his family in Spain. Like many other migrants, Juan was aware that it was not possible to accommodate family life in small bedrooms that were often no more than lined adjacent mattresses on the floor or a few bunk beds in the room. Migrants' usual shared rentals were legally and physically inadequate for bringing families to Spain. Juan wanted to rent a flat because he thought he would not qualify for a mortgage. To him, private property was a superior form of housing, but in addition, he was well aware of the ease private property meant when faced with Spanish immigration services. Each autonomous community has its own process for showing proof of adequate housing. In Catalonia, the regional government, through its Department of Family and Social Well-being, was responsible for providing a report asserting the quality of that housing. According to Juan, if one had a rental agreement, the department sent someone to check your home to know that it was indeed as you described. They sent someone to see that no one else was living with you and that you were indeed able to house others, particularly children. However, as Juan explained, if one had proof of property, they never sent anyone to check anything at all. How to think then of this double bind of debt as the absence of freedom and its condition of possibility is one of the things that reading David's 3 books together allows me to reflect upon. I want to circle back to David's initial question. Why was this movement so effective in organizing around debt? As an activist of LAPA, but also as an anthropologist, I believe the movement was effective because it stayed with the problem of debt. It never tried to solve it, but showed when it became excessive and violent. The basic requirements the movement has long advocated for include stopping home evictions without proper rehousing, making mortgage properties the sole collateral to a loan, implementing rental caps, and increasing social housing availability. Although the Spanish movement for the right to housing does not seek a debt jubilee, which David advocated for in his book, it offers us a space to politicize debt relations. David never dismissed LAPA as a bunch of reformists, which several leftist activists and scholars did and continue to do. David was more interested in how people organized around debt collectively than what people did with debt individually. It's important to highlight that in over a decade, LAPA has gone from a small group of activists meeting weekly in 2009 to becoming the largest movement for the right to housing, with over 220 nodes around Spain and weekly assemblies that gather, to this day, thousands of individuals to discuss mortgage debt and political mobilization. LAPA is an effective intervention into a growing reality of financial predation, a movement that has learned to respond to injustice collectively, and a socially diverse space where ideological conceptualizations of death or of occupation, and really of many other issues, can actually change. LAPA is not an example of how David thought we should deal with death, and yet David was always ready to learn from other people's experiences and strategies. This was very much David, a self-absorbed but incredibly generous activist, mentor, scholar, and friend. While at Goldsmiths and the LSE, I often thought I had gone in for supervision, but came out knowing about Occupy or Java, or his friendship with Anton Newcomb, the lead singer from the Brian Johnston massacre. Yet, upon listening back to each of our conversations, of which I recorded many, I found detailed guides for thinking differently about what I was working on. They didn't seem terribly evident at the time, because he was never telling me how to think. Rather, David was thinking with me based on his own ethnographic examples and political aspirations. This, I believe, is a perfect reflection of how he thought and wrote. He was never trying to tell people how to think, but was inviting us into his own way of connecting seemingly disconnected phenomena, often going back several thousand years in order to do that. Let me just end by thanking today Jorge Núñez for thinking with me many of the ideas advanced here, and ALPA for the opportunity to engage with David's legacy at a time when his ideas are so greatly needed and he is dearly missed. To everyone here today, thank you for choosing to do exactly what David said occurs in mourning and other acts of memorialization. These are an essential part of the labor of people making. So let us continue making our relationships to each other matter in ways that shape the futures we want to build. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Maka. It's a lovely presentation of your own material and how it enables us to think with David. I'm going to open up the floor for questions. If you can use the raise hand function at the bottom of your screens, that would be great. I can't see everybody in one go. I've got 9 pages on my screen. So please use the raise hand function for comments and questions. I'm just trying to see if I have got people already waiting. Okay, I don't see any questions at the moment. So while people gather thoughts, perhaps if I may ask both of you to address something which stuck out to me from Keith Hart's presentation, and something that continues to trouble me, and something that I'm trying to work through with David. You know, Keith, you had this wonderful kind of grand vision of what is happening in terms of the global economy, where Marx is right and wrong, and where Goody takes us, and you know, a global history which is grounded in political economy. And you ended by telling us, or somewhere in the middle, you had this sentence, you know, which was that there are no longer any political solutions to our economic problems. This is, you know, I mean, very, very counter to David's project as I understand it, because it's all about possibilities, you know, that we can just create these communities, you know, different versions of LAPA, for example, and, you know, or Occupy, and grow them, and there are all these different spaces, and the solutions to the world lie in political possibilities. And in a way, you know, the kind of wider political economy is put aside, especially in the last book, you know, in The Dawn of Everything. We're looking at different kinds of possibilities of making life and living together. And you know, it's the old kind of tension, right, that we had in anthropology between ideology and political economy, and what is the relationship between the two. And of course, this is big tension between Marxist debates and Marxism and anarchism. And and so I wanted you to reflect on that more, into David's vision and in relation to what you're suggesting of world history, and Maka, to maybe challenge you a little bit more as well, with Hector, for example, your case that we follow through. He joins this possibility of a different, this movement for a different possibility, LAPA. But in the end, you tell us that, what he wants really is actually to just, he'd do it again. He'd own, he wants to own the house, and he doesn't want to just be in the space of reclaiming, of squatting in reclaimed houses. So it would be good to have your reflections, I guess, more on the limitations of debt in terms of the relationship between political economy and political possibilities, which is what kind of David trumps over political economy. Okay, that's a big kind of question. I've got Deborah and various other people waiting, but maybe Keith and Maka, may I turn to you?
Okay. I think there's less contrast between David and my view of politics than you indicated, especially in the debt book. I mean, he more or less finishes the analysis in 1971 and says almost nothing about what might happen later, which is to say that he felt, and I have often felt, that we, and I suppose Hegel and Marx also felt, that we can build a picture of the past because it's happened, and that should influence what we do in future, but we can't really predict what that's going to be. So in my view, in the 20th century, the world built itself around nation states, which were in various forms vehicles for the development of capitalism. And it is true that the dollar going off gold inaugurated the end of that system, in my view. That what we have been living through is the decay of national capitalism. And of course, the Reagan-Thatcher counter-revolution against post-war political economy, which was generally speaking in the interest of greater equality and public services and raising ordinary families' incomes. They have taken over and have essentially, in a way that has never been seen before, hijacked the world economy for the benefit of a very small number of people. And I mean, even though it was always the case that money and politics were hand in glove, the current siphoning of wealth via politics into the hands of very few, very rich people has no precedent in the modern world. In fact, the main precedent would be the period, the Gilded Age, but there is no precedent in the 20th century for what's going on now. So what is, and in the means of that was the free flow of capital without political hindrance. And that was used to essentially undermine organized labor and the state and all the other means that were developed after 1945 to engineer the biggest boom in world history in the interest, to a large extent, of most people. So what we're living through is the progressive decay of something that's had its fundamental institutions that we still use as the rhetoric of common existence. And we don't know how it's going to end. I mean, so we don't know what is going to happen next. We could, I mean, there could be democratic revolutions, more likely, authoritarian and fascist regimes springing up everywhere. World War III, I think, is a definite possibility. You know, so my work is concerned with helping people to place themselves in history so that when things happen that we can't really predict, they might be in a better better place to do what they can with the people who support what they believe in. And I really think, you know, if you look at anarchism, I mean, you know, I mean, Wall Street was roundly attacked by the Social Democrats, the Marxists, and everybody else for not making any proposals. You know, and this was considered to be a weakness. But you know, I think if you read the, you know, the Democratic Project or whatever it's called, I mean, he's saying that the task of anarchist demonstrations is to behave as if we were free and to persuade other people to think that they might be, but not to, you know, make demands on the existing government. The best we can do is show that they're full of shit and even risible. You know, so that, I mean, I don't think that anarchism has ever had a kind of program of, you know, I mean, you can talk vaguely about let's all be friends and join together and have communities, but, you know, I mean, the world is seriously going to hell because we have lost the framework of national capitalism that at its peak gave us the post-war 3 decades. And we have not found a world society that will secure human interests. And I don't know how we get from here to there, but that's the reason why I say that there are no longer political solutions to our economic problems, because our economic problems are global and our politics are national. And the national politics has been hijacked by a bunch of get rich quick criminals.
Thanks, Keith. Maka.
Great. Well, thank you, Alpa, for the question. And let me place my answer somewhere between the bigger theoretical narratives that we are talking about, and also the scales and temporalities at which we are talking about this, right? So when we're seeing 5,000 years of debt and the dawn of everything, it goes even further back than that. It's interesting in this example that I'm giving, and of course I'm doing this on purpose here. I'm looking at it on the day-to-day of what that looks like, right? So in the very optimistic, perhaps, reading of David and the more pessimistic view that Keith just gave us, I do place the PA somewhere in between that, because it is a space that is politicizing that is being able to change narratives, that is finding solutions to like real problems of today I don't have a home, so I need a place to live, but it's also full of contradictions and full of tensions. And I think this is very much what anthropology shows us, right? The conflicts and contradictions in which we live day to day. And this is exactly what was happening to Hector. He was very much politicized. He had become an activist. This was already very hard. These are working class migrants who were working in construction jobs, cleaning. So they had never been political actors before. And they had already transformed themselves into even calling themselves activists. So there was a transformation for sure, but we also need to understand this in the number of different instabilities in which they are living: labor instabilities, migratory instabilities, housing instabilities. So in the context of Spain, for instance, renting was a very limited option. Contracts are for 1 to 3 years. Prices have skyrocketed over the at least past decade and way before that already. So really having a place to live where you can foresee how much you'll be paying as your rent. And I'm sure this will be something that resonates with anyone who lives in a relatively big city at this point. It becomes very, very difficult. So in many ways, they were forced into private property. They did have a very specific conception of private property that meant, a better form of housing. And this is something that the PA was also trying to change, but it didn't really have that many alternatives, because the recuperated buildings, in the case of Vector, for instance, was a building that was thought for young professionals that had single one-bedroom apartments. And so actually his family was living in two apartments. So his children lived in one apartment, he lived in another one, and they had all these different dynamics that were changing. So there are some idealized visions of what family life might be, and that can be conflicting. But all of these things come into play when we're trying to think about shifting the ground underneath us. So I think that this is something that the ethnographic work allows us to think with David's work. And it's, how do we face our realities with these tools, theoretical tools, political tools, but how do we do it on a sort of day-to-day? So I'm wrestling with this, of course. I don't have a solution, but kind of what it's trying to show.
Thanks, Maka. Matthias has a direct follow-up, and then I will hand over to Deborah.
Right. Yeah. So which is directed to you, Maka. First of all, I really enjoyed that you, when you went to David, he would share with you his stories, and in order to allow you to think about your own work, and in a way, what you're doing is giving us the reverse, right? Giving us your stories, but actually through them, really allowing us to also engage with David's work in very interesting ways. So it was just a direct, quick follow-up on the question that Alpa also asked about Hector, and why, kind of in relation to what you said, that they don't reject debt, but they stayed with debt, but were kind of fighting the excesses. And I was wondering whether that was also partly because, as you said, Hector kind of, his ultimate ideal was still to own a house, and whether there was perhaps a kind of failure to see that ultimately, of course, house ownership is a myth, especially for the younger generations, right? They will never own a house; they will always only borrow a house. And I wonder whether that was also kind of something that was discussed there, or whether these ideals of house ownership, whether those were challenged within that organization or not.
Yes. So one of the things why people were willing to go into debt again is because they had learned that debts can be stopped, and they can stop paying their debts when they become excessive, when they become violent. So there was a renewed understanding of what default meant. Default is not a personal failure. Default is not you not being able to fulfill a promise, right? To them, debt is a means to an end. It allows them for freedom of movement in the sense of bringing families and having places to secure their children's livelihoods. Many of these migrants were thinking, perhaps I'd want to move back to Latin America and either grow old there, go see my parents. They lived sort of in between. And private property, or property they owned in Barcelona, meant my children will have a secure place to live. They will not go through what I went through. They won't live in bunk beds. They won't live in instability of housing. So there were all these other projects that they were working through. So debt was still seen as a way of getting something that was bigger than just being a proprietor. So it wasn't so much about being the proprietor of your home, but what that security of housing allowed for. And when debts get excessive and they get violent, there's a collective movement that will fight that excessive indebtedness. So, but there is a tension of, the morality of debt. Should we pay them? Should we not? How do we relate to it? So it's a great question, because I think it's very much linked in what the movement is doing.
Thanks.
Great, thank you, Maka. Thanks. I'm going to hand over to Deborah, and then there's a flurry of kind of chat questions, and maybe we'll have a couple of those together before we end. Deborah, first to you.
Thanks both for a very interesting kind of counterposition of two different perspectives, one very grand and the other one quite particular. And Keith, you've always been very provocative in telling us all that we are wasting our time doing ethnography, and you should all like look at the grand picture, just like you and David do. But I think that listening to Maka shows us that actually the ethnography part has got a very important role to play. And particularly, this sort of interested me. You got your Hector, who's kind of strung out between the notion that debt is the most important thing in his life, or property might be the most important thing. And that kind of mapped onto what Keith was saying, which is that David said property was not actually the most important thing, it was debt. So I just wonder whether the nature of the specific analysis David puts forward, which is quite a sort of particular one. He overthrows Marx, Weber, and all these other kind of theorists, and he's got his own line. Actually needs to be a much more pluralistic one, much like Hector, who also seemed to have a pluralistic approach to how to actually solve the problem. It wasn't like he had to actually isolate, my real problem here is property, or my real problem here is debt. He kind of had to do a sort of hodgepodge type, social action, which perhaps didn't even really fully understand the nature of his problem, but ultimately just tried to find a way of dealing with it. It's more a thought than a question, but anyway.
Well, I don't know why you put in the plug for ethnography before making that point. I just want to say that I'm writing a biography of Marcel Mauss, who was a very political person. He was a friend of Suarez before he was assassinated. He was a public figure in the socialist government around the time when the gift was made. But soon everything went banana shaped for him in the middle 20s, and he took up the job of directing the Institute of Ethnology, having spent in his whole life only 2 weeks in Morocco doing anything like ethnography. And this was because as I have found as a teacher, especially in the gift, he wanted the gift to be a kind of clarion call for what he called an economic movement from below, relying more on the salience of human interests and relations and so on. But the French capitalism of his day made it very implausible to get people into the hustings on behalf of personal relations that have been more or less cancelled. And so he found in the ethnography of archaic gift exchange, first of all, a vision of politics that is supremely personal, and also a method of ethnography that invites people to take their own stories and beliefs and possible means of action from it. I mean, there's he gave lectures in the Institute, were very popular for the intelligentsia. 3 of them led by I forgot, it's gone. Anyway, 3 surrealists challenged him once and said they realized that none of them had the same idea of what his lectures were about. So they did an experiment, and sure enough, that's how it turned out. They were very angry about this. They cornered him after one of his lectures and said, "Don't you care about getting your message across to the audience?" And he said, "Far be it from me to think I should impose my thoughts on you, gentlemen. I hope to help you to discover your own." And that's why he became, for 2 generations, the inspiration for the first ethnographers in France. And he gave up politics, and he sat there and he had, drank with his students. He gave improvised lectures. He chatted endlessly, gave up all his financial journalism. And I have a friend called Nicolas Adel.
Keith, Sorry.
Sorry, can I just finish this?
Yes,
I have
please.
a friend called Nicholas Adele who gave me a phrase that is helping me to write the book. He said that that Malsamos is a concrete dialectician. And as a teacher, I tried to teach world history over and over again and always failed. I blamed the students for lacking a historical vision. But in fact, it's a lot easier to insert yourself creatively into a novel or an ethnography or a movie than it is into something issued by the Politburo or your professor in the form of a lecture. So I'm actually going through a period of massively upgrading the value that I place on ethnography, at least for readers, if not necessarily for practitioners.
Thanks, Keith, for that. And hopefully we'll hear more about Morse next week as well from Keir Martin and Aisha Chubakchu, who will be discussing fragments. There are a few questions in the chat, and although we finished the seminar at 12:15, please, we will not be offended if you leave this room right now, but I would like to give Maka and Keith the opportunity to look at some of these questions. And maybe Michael, you're still with us, so if you would like to ask your question in just like a minute, and also maybe Monica. And we've got Jonas whose hand is raised. So maybe we'll have all of you speak together and then hand the floor back to Maka and Keith before we wrap up.
Thanks, LAPA. This is great sessions that I was doing. It's very lovely to see this work on David Graeber coming forth. My question was simply taking, if one glosses Graeber's idea of exchange or theory of value as every exchange that we make demonstrates or performs the world that we live in. Some people perform worlds where they're more important. They they own something and somebody owes them money. Some people perform worlds where it's a sort of gift exchange, we're all equal. And so those performances, in some sense, if they don't feel very fair to some people, then they have to be backed up. Does David Graeber, what is the role, do you think, of violence or hidden violence in, say, performing a relationship of debt? We are important, you aren't, pay us the money that you owe us. But also, some people want to pay this debt back. They feel like they owe it. It is the opening chapter. So maybe that relationship, how do people feel about the idea that people fall into that? And does that mean that violence isn't important in keeping hold of a feeling of debt or of any other type of social relationship? I hope that was...
Michael, as I understand, violence is absolutely central to David's arguments, but maybe we'll hand over to Monica and then Jonah.
Okay, thank you for giving me the chance to ask my question. Yeah, and thank you very much, Maka, for your talk and sharing your fascinating work. So I basically gonna read my question. I put it in the chat. So one of the main points that stick with me, what you were talking about, is that by politicizing debt, collective responses to debt and interventions actually against the financialization of everyday life become possible. And here I see many links to the ongoing struggles in Latin American feminist movements, so especially in Argentina, but not only, and also to the work of scholars like Lucy Caballero and Veronica Gago. And they are examining the relationship between debt and social reproduction. And so I would like to ask, how would you relate this feminist reading of debt to your work, and also how you would relate it to David's approach to debt? Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you. Jonah.
Hi, thank you. One of the things that I was really struck by in both presentations was this sort of normative strand that seems to run quite deeply in David's analysis. And it really struck me in Maka's, when Maka was talking about 3 ideas of freedom in David's most recent book. So it seems to me that this kind of normative idea of freedom is very central, and basically the idea that in some social arrangements there's going to be more freedom than in others, and the ones in which there's more freedom is actually better. You know, freedom is better, and that's really striking, because it also feels like something that we can, as individuals, as people, we sort of know what that means in some way, what freedom means. I wonder if that's kind of linked a bit to his appeal. And then and that really seems to run very kind of counter to a lot of, I feel, my training as an anthropologist and a lot of our kind of instincts as anthropologists, which of course is to be super relative and not normative at all. So yeah, I would just sort of a comment, and I'd like to hear your reflections on whether you think we should be being a little bit more normative maybe in our anthropology.
Great question, Jonah. Thanks. And there's also a comment by Julio Linares in the chat, which you can read. I don't think there's a question in there. So over to Maka and to Keith. Maka, you first.
Great. Thank you so much for these questions. They're really great. I will try to somewhat combine them or go through them as fast as I can. So yes, violence, as Alpa said, is fundamental in the way that David is thinking about this, right? So debt, monetary debts, is violence, is math and violence. So this is how they sort of become real for people. And this was very much real in the case of my own interlocutors. I think that also, and especially what he's proposing in debt, or what he's getting at as well, is that there are other ways to think outside precisely those ideas of economic exchange, right? So if we can break with the idiom of debt that has permeated our societies, what else is there for us to make our social worlds possible? And I think that something that's very important, and it ties back to Deborah's question before, is that we're shifting between these moralities. And I think this is very important in David's work. He's not saying we need an anarchist view. He actually says there's never been an anarchist society. I don't know if that could exist. Same for sort of Marxist ideas, but he's also trying to think about how communism is, capitalism is not, the thing that will always be. And this is particularly in the dawn of everything, something that both Davids will sort of take up in trying to imagine how this will end and something else will come. And in doing that, historically, they show that this is not, today capitalism ended and tomorrow we have something else, but it will happen in our daily lives. So we do make it. How that happens is yet to be seen, but that's sort of the invitation as well. How do we want that to happen? Regarding Monica's question, super important. Thank you so much, Monica. Definitely important work from lots of feminist Latin American scholars. Caballero and Gago are economists, and they're approaching debt mainly thinking about extractivist economies as well. And I think that care and labor would become especially important. David does a lot of reflection with that, but in the work of the PA, it qualified itself as a feminist movement. And the idea was, what happens if we put care at the center of what we do, right? So if instead of thinking about paying back the bank, you use that money for caring for your children. And that's what you should be doing, right? So how do we shift those organizations of our daily life? And I do take this part in my understanding of how to think about what debt means. And last, in Jonah's question, I think that the same happens with freedom, and both Davids do this. They mention 3 freedoms, but they say there's a shifting between them, right? So we're never just in one of those freedoms. So we are constantly moving, and this is what allows us to build something new, that we're not, and we don't have to sign up to one thing that we have delineated is how we would like things to be for everyone all the time, but rather that there is a lot of back and forth between those. And I think that's why anthropology and ethnography is so important, because we're able to see how that happens in the ground. How are people moving between these moral economies or ideas of how morality plays out? How do we move along those freedoms, and what spaces open up, right? So if we take care into account, if we take violence into account, if we put our social relationships at the center, what could come out, right? And I think that this is where ethnography does show us spaces where this is happening. So we can actually do things different.
Thanks. Thank you, Maka. Keith, if you'd like to have just address whatever you would like of those three comments, and we will then close.
Yeah, okay. I mean, I have, you know, Deborah is an old friend of mine, and we share many interests. And I've never, I think her work on debt in South Africa is a brilliant realization of how people on the ground experience it. But she basically cops out from saying how this has got anything to do with South African political economy. So I don't privilege grand theorization for its own sake. In fact, unless I can realize what I have to say in concrete terms that are personally accessible, I've just written a book that's coming out in spring. It's 300 pages, and almost all of it is illustrated by anecdotes, personal or otherwise. So, and I think that the interesting question that came up was about why do people, which is the original question of the book, why do people feel that they should pay back a debt? And David has some very, the answer to this is in the chapter on the moral grounds of economic relations, where he says there are people left to their own devices share in a free way. He calls it everyday communism. Then you have reciprocity and finally hierarchy. But he says that hierarchy and reciprocity are both transformations of the idea of debt. The difference is that in hierarchy, the debt is permanent, and in reciprocity, the debt is presumptively temporary. David hated reciprocity, and it led him to some great funny observations. Why do the middle classes train their children to say please and thank you? Because saying please or thank you immediately already limits the scope of the debt and kind of reasserts your desire to be on the other side of the equation. So, but partly I think the problem of this analysis, which comes up a lot in his work, he talks about we, why is it we do this? It's often not specified in sociological terms who we are. And I can only offer, my own experience in the 1970s, which was the first post-war housing boom. And I was married with no money. And in the space of 8 years, bought and sold 5 houses and ended up with £250,000 in equity. And, and all my friends have been trained to fear debt. And I realized that as long as the housing boom went, I could take a loan that I couldn't afford and then sell again as soon as things had gone quick enough, pay off the debt and end up with more capital and do it again. I did this 5 times in a decade. And everybody else said, even my wife said, this is terrible. We're going to end up in debtor's prison. We can't afford this. And I said, don't worry, it's not going to break yet. So this is where debt and credit kind of turn around. I will say this, the recipe for viable and progressive social democracy in the 20th century, especially after the Second World War, was mild inflation. Mild inflation gave people the idea that their property was increasing in value. They committed to it, and I mean, you know, that was really, you know, as long as, you know, I mean, Keynes wrote a beautiful book called, you know, The Economics of Persuasion, in which he says, who benefits from inflation? Debtors. Who loses from inflation? Bankers and savers. Their money, you know, so the relationship between credit and debt has been historically, I mean, where do you think the English-speaking peoples came up with the idea, own a house and you make money? I mean, there wasn't a society in the world before the mid-20th century in which that idea, you know, Americans always feared owning houses until quite recently because of the costs of maintenance and so on. So I think this question, which is the central question, deserves probably more treatment than we gave it today. But I was asked to speak for 20 minutes on the biggest historical book he ever wrote. And I felt I was obliged to deal with it in its terms, as
Thank
well
you,
as
Keith.
you know.
Keith, you did a grand job, and Maka, you amazing. Thank you for sharing and your presentations. Thank you everybody for coming, your questions, your engagement. It's wonderful to see you all, and we hope to see you again next week at 11 o'clock. We will close this session, but for anyone who wants to stay on for an informal session, just come back to the same call in a couple of minutes, and we can hang out for a little bit longer. 10-15 minutes more. Okay, lovely to see you all. Thank you everybody. Thank you, Maka. Thank you, Keith.
Thank you everyone.